Hello and welcome to the latest edition of Around the Desk. I'm Drew McCoy, joined today by Alex L. Dunson and Dr. Alexander Podcool. This is going to be our pre-Nevada show, or if you prefer, day 18 of the Iowa caucus. You decide how you wish to look at this. Yeah, you guys ready for Nevada? You feeling it?
Shouldn't there be a rule that like Iowa has to report their final stuff before the next caucus? Like, shouldn't we be delaying Nevada until then?
Well, first of all, at the top, should we just go out? It is Nevada, right? They're very picky about that.
I was actually consciously thinking about it as I said it.
I don't know. Unless John Ralston's listening, it just doesn't matter. If he is listening, we're going to get beat up on Twitter. But now he's a big star because he was on the debate, so he won't talk to us anymore.
No,
actually, why don't we just call it what it is? The Clark County caucus. That's essentially what it comes down to in the state, doesn't it?
Pretty much.
Yeah. So the Nevada caucus. Yeah, it's very similar to what happens in Iowa in terms of it being a caucus, but there are some twists. One of the big ones is going to be this early voting. I don't know how much you guys have followed this. What the latest I saw was something like 75,000 people have already voted early. They had 85,000 or so in 2016, which was down from the 2008 number, which was around 118,000. So it's always tough to tell with early voting whether you're cannibalizing day of voting or you're going to see a bump because of enthusiasm and you just get these people turned out. But that's one thing we're going to be watching for. But yeah, let's talk about the sort of the elephant in the room about how this is going to work. There have obviously been some concerns based on day 18 of Iowa. They were going to use very similar technology to Iowa, and the Nevada Democrats, in the wake of what happened, really have apparently just torn that plan up and put another one in place, which is good because they won't have the problems they had in Iowa. The problem may be they may have their own problems because they're trying to put this together on the fly. It's really the old story about building the airplane in flight at the moment, and whether or not there's going to be sufficient time to train people how to use the new tools. They're very clear that it's not an app, it's tools. It's commercially available Google stuff for the most part, combined with iPads. But it really does come down to whether or not they're going to have the time to train people how to do this. Now, on top of the technology issue, Nevada had a second twist that was always going to be different, and that is that early voting. And the challenge there is, if you voted in one of the early voting in the last 3 or 4 days, your vote has to be taken and connected up with your home precinct. That strikes me. You guys are the data people. That strikes me as maybe not the hardest thing in the world, but not the easiest thing either to match those votes to precincts when it's not something you do all the time, right? That's going to be a bit of a technological and organizational challenge, correct?
Yeah, I think that's the main part is, you don't do this all the time. I think if you had all of the precinct captains be folks who work with data a lot, out of the 2,000 or so precincts, maybe there'd be like 20 errors or something like that. But you're talking about folks who are, in often cases, retired, don't deal with data very much, don't deal with even technology very much in some cases. There was the story about the tech manual for the iPads. So if you're having to explain how to turn on an iPad, you might have a rough time with this.
And then the second part of this is those people, those volunteers, and they really are. And I personally think there's something charming about this sort of, individual participatory democracy. Maybe that has become so big and so important that it's not as charming if your campaign and millions of dollars have been spent on it. But it really is, citizens going out there and participating in their party's election plans. But what happens is, as you say, these are volunteers, often older people that got more involved. They're going to have to take those lists of the individual voter who voted, sometime last week, maybe at a different county, certainly in a different town, perhaps. take those lists and then match them up for every voter. So with the caucus system, you have the first alignment and the second alignment. The first alignment is everybody says, these are my first choices. The person running the caucus is going to serve as the proxy for those early voters and have to allocate them correctly. And then if that group isn't viable, if it doesn't reach the viability threshold, reallocate those votes. So if you're an early voter, you actually were told to vote for 3 to 5 candidates in order of preference, so that if when you voted last Saturday, you voted for, Tulsi Gabbard, but at your local precinct, Tulsi Gabbard's not reaching the viability point. Well, then you say, well, I want Pete Buttigieg. Well, what if Buttigieg isn't viable? Then you have to go to your third choice, which is, say, Bernie Sanders. That's something these volunteers are going to have to do repeatedly. And we just don't know how many times they're going to have to do that. What if you have a precinct caucus, and I don't know, it has 150 people show up, but then there's 30 or 40 absentees? That's a lot of, figuring and refiguring and recalculating to do.
Yeah, Drew, that's a good point. I think especially on that sort of second ballot, like that's where there's going to be any kink in the hose, I think, in just trying to reallocate that, which just makes me think of all those sheets I guess we saw on Twitter, all those precinct worksheets we saw coming out of Iowa, which sort of raises the question, which I think, Drew, you probably know the answer best. What type of information are we expecting to get out of Nevada? So in Iowa, this was sort of the first year that we had the state delegate equivalents plus the first round plus the final round. And one thing we learned was that there was, for lack of a better word, general incompetence throughout the state in terms of even rounding and adding. So even beyond the issues of the application, there were also just basic math issues that were appearing on the precinct worksheets. What kind of information are we expecting to get out of from the Democratic Party in Nevada this weekend?
Very similar, but with a couple of twists. So yes, we will get the precinct data. They will also be providing it up through the county and the congressional district level, which is important because of how delegates are awarded. They don't do in Iowa. It was a contest for state delegate equivalents. In Nevada, they do it down a level to county convention delegates. Same sort of thing. That has an equivalency to the national delegates, which the party will be announcing. The twist, though, is twofold again. And you guys may know this. Alex Aldunson may know because you've gone through the delegate allocation. But I believe the difference is there's not necessarily a county convention element that's preset like there is in Iowa. It's based on turnout at the actual precinct caucus. So the multiplication number, it hasn't even been set yet, which will then have to be repeated several times. It's not complicated multiplication, but it can be kind of weird where you're just doing, something times 0.375892, and you have to do it several times. It just, we don't do a lot of basic math. It's not hard, but it's just complicated in that way. And also the viability threshold at the precinct level isn't necessarily 15%. That also has to do with turnout and some other issues. So it seems there are a few more things that people are going to have to calculate that were at least known factors going into Iowa. They're sort of unknown and variable with the other variability of the absentee voters. So, obviously the original plan was there was an app that was going to handle all this, and it would just be a much more plug and play kind of thing. I gather that's what they're trying to reproduce using this calculator tool, and Google Sheets, and also the ability to call into a hotline, which hopefully, that number won't become public this time, and you won't have people, trying to wait 2-3 hours to report these numbers or to ask questions. It looks like what's going to happen is the caucuses themselves start at noon Pacific time, so 3 Eastern. However long it takes to actually conduct the caucus, obviously I think if we're going to see numbers early on, we'll see them from sort of the outlying areas where they'll be smaller, fewer people, less complicating factors. They may not also have the early vote totals that a place like Clark County does to deal with. So the plan that, as I understand it from the Nevada Democrats, is they don't have a set schedule. They're not saying, hey, we're going to release it at 10%, 20%, 30%. They'll be releasing numbers as they intake them, are able to do whatever quality assurance checks they're going to do on in terms of math and make sure things work out. And then they'll be releasing them as they can. It's going to be a little bit of we'll see how it goes when we get there kind of factor, I think. Hopefully, in the last 2.5 weeks, they've been able to run through this, but I think it's a pretty heavy lift. So we're just going to have to see.
At what point do you think that we'd be able to tell if something's wrong? Like at what time, if we don't have results, that's like a red flag?
I would be guessing, and everything's guessing at this point. I would think if we don't see something in the first 2 hours or so, if you don't start seeing something from these outlying counties, which are really small. If you're not familiar with Nevada, there's Clark County, then way down the list is Washoe, and then way down the list is everyone else. Just in terms of population and the center of gravity, certainly in the Democratic primary or Democratic caucus. So if we don't see for some of these counties that are going to be producing a few thousand votes, then I think that's probably a red flag that there are even bigger issues. Because if you're not having significant success in some of these more manageable sized areas, I just don't know what happens when you get to Clark. You get to Vegas and the suburbs.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I guess the sort of last piece I want to make on sort of the general context is in Iowa, we hear a lot about the coin flips to decide a tie. And I think my favorite fun fact about the Nevada Caucus is they pick a card from a deck, and whoever has the higher card, that's how they settle the tiebreaker, which is pretty fantastic if we think about it.
100% on brand.
Oh, definitely. And I guess talking about it, let's kind of switch to polling what the state of the race is right now in the state. And so right now, with our overall polling aggregation, just looking at the public polls that are available, we do see Sanders ahead quite a bit. We did see sort of a pretty big drop in Joe Biden's vote share. And then again, at the bottom of the screen, we see that flat line by Bloomberg. And that's mostly, not mostly, entirely because he's not even running in the state. And so he's running that flat line, which we'll pay attention to a little bit more when we talk about the national polling. But right now, it seems to be Sanders is in the lead. But what sort of, to Alex Aldunson, what's sort of your take on the Nevada polling, and what are some of the difficulties, I guess, associated with it? Well,
so first of all, I'll start by saying I think it's pretty clear that Mitch McConnell's going to lose the caucus based off of this data. But on a more serious note, I think, Bernie at this point is expected to win. And so looking at the expectations game in New Hampshire, he was expected to win by 5 or more points, and it ended up being pretty close as the night went on. I think you'll see sort of a similar dynamic in terms of the expectation games here, where if he does end up winning by, I think it's fair to say he's expected to win by close to double digits, then he'll get that boost as anticipated. But if it does end up being a replay of New Hampshire where second place, be that Biden or Buttigieg or someone else, come rather close to him, and in the delegate count it ends up being a wash, that might honestly hurt him at this point. So that's one of the things that I'm looking at is the top. Second thing I'm looking at is who comes in second. Is it Biden? If it's Biden, you could argue that his free fall is maybe ending, and the data that's coming out of South Carolina that shows him still winning, albeit by a small margin, maybe holds. And the sort of death of his campaign might have been a little premature. Or is it someone else? Buttigieg basically tied in Iowa, came in a close second in New Hampshire, so you could see him coming in second again. Warren had, I think, a good debate this week, and so does she bump up a few points and come in second? or is there, some other surprise?
Yeah, it's also been interesting to see from the Warren numbers how associated with sort of her rise in the polls last summer going into autumn. She had a pretty staggering lead in Nevada, and I think the conventional wisdom that was the Warren campaign especially was focusing on Nevada as a way to, they were making assumptions about, well, she's probably going to do pretty well in New Hampshire, so then Nevada then becomes the next piece of capturing the media narrative. But her numbers on the screen right now have dipped pretty drastically. Do you think, I mean, as Alex, you were saying before, I think we're going to be paying attention a lot to especially the second, third, fourth place positions. If only, even if it doesn't translate into a big difference in delegates, if only to in how they possibly relate to the expectation game and other broader media narratives. But if you're, say, Elizabeth Warren, and I'm picking her campaign especially because of the great debate that she had earlier this week, at what point do you think it's a great night for, or a great afternoon for Warren? And at what point do you think, well, maybe we should start thinking about hanging up the hat of the campaign? And I'm interested in both your thoughts on that point for Warren's expectation.
One quick thought on that, though, is, she's generally credited with having great debate, but that came after all that early voting was already in. And not knowing exactly what percentage of the final turnout that's going to be, I think you have to factor that into how you rate her and her performance. She might have expected a bigger bump had it happened the week before, or had there been no early voting, and see something more akin to the Klobuchar bounce that we saw in New Hampshire. It's just going to be hard to tell how to factor that in, how you price that into her performance, because of 70,000 plus votes already having been cast before she ripped out Mike Bloomberg's bleeding heart and showed it to him on stage that night.
Now, I will say that, second through basically sixth place here in Nevada are close enough that even though she won't get the bump among early voters per se, I think she might be able to rise up a couple spots still. Kind of depends on how many votes are left. My gut tells me that we're about halfway through the votes at this point, but it can definitely make a difference. I
Halfway
think,
through would be a huge turnout. I mean, that would
Yeah.
crush 2008.
Yeah, I mean, the way I see it, right, is in the past it's always just been a one-day caucus. Essentially, now you have a caucus and you also have an option of more or less voting, the week before.
It's kind of like a
So,
hybrid ranked choice voting
yeah,
primary kind of thing now.
yeah. On what sort of place it needs to be, I think Warren is the exception in that third place might still be a decent result for her. I think in general, though, we're a week away, a week and a half away from Super Tuesday, which I think is going to set up the end game for the campaign. There's no there I don't think you're going to get much of a bump for third place anymore. I don't think that, even New Hampshire, for instance, Klobuchar comes in third, seems like a great deal. A week later, you know, I don't see much momentum coming out of that. So I think it's second place or bust for basically everyone that's behind Sanders, with the possible exception of Warren, just because she was completely lackluster in her results up until now.
One thing I would say about the bump, though, you're right. Klobuchar has these things where she gets, wow, she had a great debate. Wow, she did New Hampshire and doesn't show up nationally or anywhere else. She did raise a ton of money. And Elizabeth Warren, if she could parlay a third place into a lifeline of some money, would be a pretty big win, even if it doesn't necessarily instantaneously, start showing up in polling, because this is going to start happening so fast. And the problem with Super Tuesday is how many of those votes are already in the bank, especially in some of the larger states. But these candidates are really getting to the point where money's becoming as much of an issue as votes, but votes are an issue too. So it becomes this very negative feedback loop. If you can't produce one, you can't get the other. So I think she would be thrilled if she could get $12 million like Klobuchar did out of a third place finish and a good debate.
Yeah, I mean, ideally you have both. If you have money but you don't have momentum or a strong base, you're kind of just like a zombie campaign, running and running. You can run through Super Tuesday and maybe afterwards, but if you're not getting any delegates, the money's going to run out sooner or later.
But
If
that may
you
be what
have-
people are playing for, for this whole nobody's going to get 50%.
Well, yes, but you still have to get delegates, right? If you're coming in at 10% statewide, you're probably not getting any delegates, or maybe you're getting a couple at the congressional district level. But if you go into the convention with 50 delegates, you're not coming out of it with the nomination. So you still have to be able to at least
Right.
compete.
Yeah,
now,
well, I was just
the
going to
other-
pivot back to some of the
Go ahead.
numbers, and before we get to the point where we start talking about how Michelle Obama is going to win the nomination on the floor of the convention, let's also take a look at some of the national polling that we have as well, just to sort of, as we've been mentioning, what Nevada is going to say about the overall race. It is interesting to see the national polling. Where we have a pretty different race here than even just a few weeks ago when we were talking, where we've had that Sanders surge up to first place, and then obviously, as everybody's talking about, the Bloomberg surge up to third place, although now people are sort of debating whether or not that has some staying power now after he's made his introduction to the debate. What do we think the effects of the Nevada caucus results are going to have on sort of the national picture?
So I think it's sort of a lagged effect. I think a lot of folks aren't paying too much attention to the race yet. And so, up until the week or two before they have to vote. And so what you're seeing nationally is essentially a lagged picture of what you saw in some of the early states, especially if you sort of average them together. Buttigieg, for instance, as mentioned a little earlier, tied in Iowa, came in second in New Hampshire, but is barely cracking double digits in nationally. That's gone up. It hasn't gone up quite as much as it has in the early states. So I think the effect is essentially whittling down the field potentially. Although Nevada, this year it looks like maybe the candidates stay in, kind of as zombie campaigns. But moreover, sort of informs later states as to which candidates really have a chance and they should be supporting them, and which candidates don't really stand much of a chance. And so you'll sort of, I think, see whatever happens in Nevada and South Carolina. Those trend lines will probably start reflecting nationally, whether that be, let's say a Warren bump in Nevada. You might see a resurgence of Warren nationally after the fact. Or, if Buttigieg is able to continue his run, him looking more like a second or third place nationally kind of candidate. I think that's the main effect.
Right, and both of these pieces feature into the broader story, right? It's not just polling, as Drew was saying before. It's also money, and we could have this debate for the 15th time about endorsements and other factors. But this might be a good segue into our forecasting and talking about that. So, Alex, first, do you kind of just want to discuss what we're expecting, what some of the forecasted vote shares are that are on the screen right now, and just like kind of a 90 seconds on the methodology behind it?
Yeah, sure. So we've been forecasting the Democratic nomination for about a month now, and we're going to keep going through Super Tuesday and beyond. Essentially, we have a national forecast that gives the probability of a candidate being able to receive a majority of the delegates during the course of the primary season. That right now is actually giving about a coin flip chance that no candidate secures a majority. Doesn't necessarily mean there'll be a contested convention, but it just means that they'll have to be a little bit of wrangling here or there at a minimum before the convention, and there's a potential that it spills over onto the convention floor. State by state, we also have forecasts, and those manifest themselves in vote share. So we actually predict what percent of the vote we expect Bernie to get, Biden to get, and all the other candidates to get. And so on the screen right now is the Nevada forecast, and you can see that as of right now, we've got Sanders coming in about 9 points ahead of Biden, who's in second, but there's this whole cast right behind him. And so it's a very fluid situation for second place. This is not our final prediction. We're going to be putting out our final Nevada prediction later today, or potentially tomorrow morning if there is a late breaking poll. But yeah, that's roughly what's going on there. And then South Carolina, same sort of situation with vote shares. We do still have Biden up, albeit by a very small margin.
One thing that jumps out to me with both Nevada and South Carolina numbers are we have quite a number of candidates near that 15% threshold. Here's a question for either of you. What does that necessarily mean in terms of translating these vote shares into delegates? So on South Carolina, for example, we only have 2 candidates above 15%. And so if my understanding's right, then that's a big haul of delegates that would only go to 2 people. In the Nevada forecast, we have Sanders quite a bit ahead, and then we have about 4 candidates who are 4, maybe 5 candidates all hovering near that 15%. What might that mean in terms of translating the vote shares to delegates?
Well, first of all, you have to look at it as that's a statewide number. Now, obviously, that's going to track closely with the county and up to the CD level, but it is possible for a candidate to be viable at the congressional district level and not at the state level to win delegates. And that's also why you're seeing a little bit of, as much as I was saying about some of those outlying areas not mattering as much and certainly being significantly smaller, you can do more with fewer votes if you focus on them there. So you may see somebody sneak in, but again, you're only talking 1 or 2, maybe not even 2, because they're so tightly compacted. And Alex has been heading up our delegate stuff. One question that dawns on me: if you had 4 candidates or 5 candidates that got the threshold level, could the lower one not get any delegates?
Yes.
Yeah. So that would be.
It almost happened in New Hampshire. Basically, to make a long story short, the calculation, there's 2 different statewide ones and 1 per congressional district, 4 in Iowa. That's why I naturally gravitated to 4 and 4 in Nevada. So in Iowa, for instance, Klobuchar got 1 delegate. She didn't make the 15% threshold statewide, but she just barely sneaked in one of the congressional districts, so she got 1. Since there's so many that could potentially make the 15% threshold, it's an extremely volatile situation. Bernie Sanders with 30% of the vote in one state might end up with over 60% of all of the delegates for that state. If there's one other candidate that sneaks in at 15 and then everyone else is just below it, or at 30% of the vote, he might only get 35% of the delegates because Buttigieg gets in, Biden gets in, Klobuchar gets in, Warren gets in, and then all of a sudden now he's getting pretty close to proportionate of what he got as vote share for his delegates. So it's extremely volatile when it comes to delegates.
And we should keep in mind too, these early states, we're sort of at the midway point of the early. We're getting to the end of the beginning. They're not really about delegates. You're not going to stake your claim here. The delegates reflect your momentum, really. So the difference in numbers isn't that huge, compared to, say, a state like California, again, where Sanders has a tremendous lead. There was even a poll showing him being the only one above 15%. Now that was an outlier, but it just shows you sort of the range of possibilities. If Sanders actually somehow managed to be the only candidate to be viable statewide in California, that would be a tremendous haul of delegates. It would, I think, dwarf probably what was available in all of February. So the scale of what we're talking about is going to change substantially as well. Nobody can win the number needed on Super Tuesday, but you can build a lead that really becomes hard to catch up with because of this proportionality. But the range of potential outcomes really is great when you're talking about a field that's still this large and this clustered around that 15% mark.
So are we going to walk into a convention where, Austin, if you hit the national? So right now the forecast, we're saying 48% no majority. What do I take of that? So if it is, let's say it is 48%, Alex, what's sort of the next steps here from a practical perspective? And is there a way we're thinking of some of the more likely outcomes if we do get to a world where no candidate receives a majority of the delegates going into the first ballot at the convention?
So I think the biggest factor is how close to 50% of the delegates is the leader, which presumably at this point Bernie Sanders has the highest probability of being that leader going into it. The closer they are to 50, the less drama that there's going to be. And then the second most important factor is how close is the nearest competitor to Bernie, or to whoever the leader is. The further behind they are, even if Sanders or someone else are only at 40% of the delegates, if the nearest competitor is at 20%, then that also sort of allows for for the party to coalesce around the leader and not have much drama. So I think all in all, it's more likely than not that we don't end up on the convention floor with some drama, and our model sort of reflects that. We've got a 52% chance that someone has a majority, and then within that 48%, there's a lot of wiggle room for stuff to happen. But that's essentially, I think, that's my take on it.
Looking at the numbers on the screen right now, 48% no majority, 24% Sanders, 12% Buttigieg, 6% Bloomberg, 5% Biden, 4% Klobuchar. Let's ask our favorite question. Who would you rather be?
Beyond Bernie?
No, Bernie's got to be a choice, right?
Were you thinking other than Bernie, or were you thinking including Bernie?
No, including Bernie, because I mean we're still in a situation where depending on what that vote share actually looks, or that delegate count, as you were talking about, maybe the differential between the majority line and Sanders's vote share, that could be the difference as to what determines the tone of the convention. And so, no, including Bernie. Are we sort of all in agreement that we'd rather be Senator Sanders, the independent from Vermont?
At this point, yeah.
Drew?
I'm going to play the part of Alex L. Dunson, and I'm going to take Joe Biden.
You know what's funny? Is I was thinking that.
Yeah, okay, let me build a scenario.
Yeah, please.
He comes in a strong second tomorrow, and strong being relative, because I think it's pretty clear Sanders is going to have a fairly comfortable win. He wins. He's not going to win by what people were thinking he would win South Carolina by a couple months ago, but he may win it by more than they were thinking he would a couple of weeks ago. So he's got some reasonable expectations. I think Bloomberg may have had a moment. So you start to see some of these other states going towards Biden, or at least, he gets a lot of strong seconds maybe in places you didn't think, and suddenly he's back. And if that you come out of this, with it being 40 plus or minus 5% for Biden and Sanders, Sanders gets to 45 and Biden's at 38% of the delegates in Milwaukee, I think there's going to be a lot of pressure to go with Biden.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely don't disagree with that scenario. I think if you look at the national polls, and the rise in Bloomberg has almost perfectly mirrored the drop in Biden. If you essentially take that trend and reverse it back, you've got Biden up nationally again, and not by 1 or 2 points either. So if come
And if
Super Tuesday,
Klobuchar drops out soon, or Buttigieg sort of fades to the back and drops out soon,
right? And if you play that scenario out on Super Tuesday, it's a dogfight on Super Tuesday, and probably neither candidate ends up with much of a delegate lead, and so at that point it's game on. But I think probabilistically at this point, it's more likely that Sanders does maintain his lead. But that's definitely a very realistic outcome, I think.
All right, well, that's going to wrap up, I think, our Nevada preview and our look around the field. We hope that you enjoyed it, but also please like, favorite, and do all those things on whichever platform you follow this on, so that we know you're there. You'll get updates, and you'll also be able to see the highlights of the show shortly if you missed anything. We're not going to be doing a live stream tomorrow. Just want to make sure people understand that, because we really just don't know what's going to happen. And, we did this 6-hour with no vote thing once before. So we've got that covered. We are going to do a follow-up early next week, and then we will be doing the preview show and Saturday night in South Carolina with the desk. What could be better a week from tomorrow? So that's where we are right now. We appreciate you joining us. Alex L. Dunstan, as always, Dr. Alexander Podkul, appreciate all your time here today. And that's going to do it for us. Thanks for listening. Oh, wait, there's more.
Yeah, and if you appreciated my Mitch McConnell joke, unlike these two mean guys, leave a comment. Let me know so that I can make more terrible jokes in the future.
In truth in advertising here, please leave the comment, but he's going to make the terrible jokes anyway, regardless. So it'll be okay. We love the terrible jokes.
I don't think Podcool does.
All right. Well, we got him outvoted. All right. Thanks, everyone, for listening. We will have results if there are results, and when they do come in. As I said, we're not doing a live stream, but we will have them on our page. We'll be putting the links up on Facebook and our blog, Twitter as well, so you can follow along with all of that tomorrow as things unfold. Until next time, I'm Drew McCoy. Thanks very much for listening to Around the Desk.